Hey everybody, welcome back to class. It's Wednesday, February the 3rd, and we'll be underway in just a few moments. So hope everyone watching this, wherever you are, whenever you are, doing well. If you're watching this in 100 years from now, greetings from 2021. It's been a tough year, I guess, on the planet Earth. Some of us are doing okay, though, for all you future people. About 3 more minutes till class time. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Usually attendance kind of just floods in at the last moment, so not to worry, just hang in there. About 2-3 minutes, we'll start our meeting. Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to class. Just get comfortable. Got about 90 seconds until official class time, and I'll get things underway. Hope your first week is going smooth so far this spring. Oh yeah, hello. How's it going? I mean, if you don't have hope, then you're just lost. Isn't that the case? But it's genuine. I mean, I feel that way. I want you guys to have a good day. I want you to have a good week, good life. Will my cat be featured in the lecture? Yeah. Maybe she'll come out. Right now she's kind of sleeping, so she's kind of random with it, but I wouldn't doubt that she'll wander in here at some point in the meeting. If not today, then for sure throughout the semester you're going to see her. And Eddie. I have Eddie. There's 2 cats. Eddie's the boy, the big bro. Okay, guys. Hopefully you're getting comfortable. Got your viewing set up the way you want it. And yeah, just a few seconds here. All right, cool. So it's pretty much 10 a.m. Therefore, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Thanks, everybody, for being here today so far. This is our YouTube channel. This is the academic channel that we're going to be watching and attending these lectures on. So, now you're here, you know exactly where to go and how to find it. Every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 10 to 10:50, you simply have to come to this channel, attend the live lecture, participate, give whatever questions, comments, reactions that you can, and then you'll be on to the rest of your day from there. So let me just begin with this little request. I know that there's still people kind of filing in. It's the first day you're meeting me at YouTube Live, so maybe some students are taking their time to find a meeting. But if you're already here, I would ask that you do this just to announce your attendance. This is going to be my little way of keeping a record of that. Like I've told you before, I'm not a big stickler or an enforcer of such rules, but I want to at least have some kind of record to refer to if it's important for any later purpose. So all those that are here present, and it's also good for you to get experience using the live chat. So this could be your first comment in the live chat. Please just write down hello, good morning, or whatever you want, even if it's just here or present. And then I'll see your comment appear in the live chat, and that'll be your record of attendance. So that's how you're going to get counted for being present. So let's get that out of the way really fast. Thank you. Okay, good. Thanks so much. And let me say this, if there are any students who use a different username than their name on the class roster, then just help me to make sure that I know the association between the two. Like for example, N, maybe just place your name that appears in the roster in the comments, so that way I will be able to clearly indicate that the student that was present gets credited for that, or doesn't get lost credit for that. You understand? So like if you have a different username, just simply put, hi, this is fill in the blank, your name. Okay? All right, guys, thank you so much. Good to see everybody. So this is our first meeting in Introduction to Philosophy, and I want to kind of start us off at the beginning by understanding what the word philosophy means. I'm not sure if we discussed that briefly last time, but if not, we'll go over it again right now. So does anybody have any background knowledge about this word philosophy and what it means? If you kind of break down its root meanings and you go back into its, they say, etymology. Let's see if anyone has any kind of faint recollection of this idea. If not, I'll definitely let you know, because it's what I want to teach you for the first part of the meeting. But love of wisdom. Okay, very good, Cordy. That's right. No, Olga, it's not that type of sophomoric, stereotypical way of thinking about philosophy, but it's the love of wisdom. Okay, so let me write it here. Philosophy is a word that derives from two Greek words. So first of all, the first part of it comes from the word philia, which means to love. The second part of it, so that's from Greek, and the second part of it is the word Sophia, which nowadays in the West is often just like a nice name, but originally it's a Greek word that means wisdom. So when you put these two roots together, you see that philosophy overall means the love of wisdom, and a philosopher would be one who is a lover of wisdom. So that's, I think, an interesting distinction among all academic subject matter, because most of them don't have like a passionate pursuit of something done through love, kind of based around the core of what it is. You have other topics like biology, that's the logos, the logic of life, or biosystems. But in philosophy, Sophia is a suffix there, and that's an important element or component of it. I would tell you that just historically, philosophy is like the forefather of all the other academic disciplines. Going back thousands of years to Plato's Academy, which is like the first institution of higher learning in the West, kind of like the ancestor of our modern university system, all students just study philosophy, which was considered like the master subject that was so broad that it covered everything that we call today science or literature or history. Now, of course, we've branched off and developed all these new specializations in the academy and different topics, but they all trace from philosophy. So it's actually a quite fundamentally important topic historically in the West, and it's a rich tradition that kind of never ends. So we're tapping into that now. So philosophers pursuing wisdom are trying to answer and ask questions of deep human interest to the human condition, about ourselves, about reality, about the connection between things. And so there are many different topics in philosophy that people can inquire into. Just like in science, there are many different divisions of science. Like you say, I study biology or chemistry or physics, not just in general science. In philosophy, there are many different subtopics and specializations too. And we're going to really sample many of the big ones in this class, but we're starting off with one, which is the philosophy of religion. Okay, so that's the first main subject for us, philosophy of religion. So in the philosophy of religion, we try to clarify, examine, and evaluate religious claims, the existence of God. We want to understand what are the biggest arguments that can be made that purport to either prove God exists, that attempt to criticize those arguments, what possible knowledge can we have about these matters, and these are some of the stage-setting questions that we consider within philosophy of religion. There are three main divisions among people when it comes to the question of God's existence. So let me discuss that with you guys really fast. Three main views on the existence of God. Okay, so people in general can be divided up into one of these three various categories. One is the theist, or people who adhere to theism. So let's try and all get clear on this. I'm sure it's a word that all of you have heard. Let's see, Nigel, I see that you say you had a lag. I haven't seen other students indicate that there's a problem with it. Let me know, anybody that's watching right now. Is the audio and video feed coming through clear to you? It's usually the case that there can be individual students who have intermittent connection issues and stuff, and that can be on the student's end. Okay, no lag for some of the others. So sometimes, Nigel, if you have those problems, it's okay to like leave the stream, come back, close your browser and come back, stuff like that. In general, if there ever is a connection issue that causes like a small portion of the lecture to cut out for anybody, just know that the lectures remain permanently archived on the channel, and when they're fully uploaded on YouTube, there are no problems of that kind. So any of the information remains available for you for later review if you get a temporary outage. So that's all accounted for. Okay, but thank you though for your feedback. Question though, what is a theist? What type of person is this? What does a theist think or believe? Let me know if you have any general idea about that. That's my question. What's a theist? What's the definition of theist? It's one of the positions on the question of God's existence, but which position is it? Let's see, you tell me. Yeah, so it is a person who believes that God exists. That's right. Okay, so that's what a theist is, and that's what theism is. It's the belief in the existence of God. Defined in this way, theism is definitely a pretty broad category of people. This is the vast majority of the global population if you just look at demographic and statistical tables. Most people adhere to some version of theism. So theism, as defined here, spans across many different religious traditions. It's not just Christians that are theists or just Jews or Muslims, but anyone and everyone who subscribes to the belief that there is like a divine creator God. Okay, so that's theist. Does that include the polytheist? Yes, I believe so. Yes, the polytheist just believes in a variety of different gods, but they believe in the divine, so they hold the belief in God or gods. But that's a good question. Yeah, polytheism is a version of theism as well, just more than one, as opposed to monotheism, correct? Now, next up, in contrast, obviously, there's another possible position. So not everyone is theist. What a different possibility is is atheist. So what is an atheist? That one probably you also know, just from everyday life or from your knowledge in general. What is that? Let's see if anyone can tell me quickly, if you can. No belief in God, right. So this is a person that does not believe that God exists. Okay, so minority position, but a significant minority position. I believe in the United States, something like 70+% identify Christian, and then you have a range of the other religions consuming a couple more of the percentiles, and then it's something around an order of like 10% or so are identified as atheists, don't believe in God. Right, so that's correct. Dennis, Jasmine, and others. It's not having the belief that God exists, not believing that God exists. And then, oh, well, I would mention this, even though it's a minority position, I've heard some analysis that shows that it seems to be a growing share of the Western world, despite the fact that it's still quite a minority. But anyway, that's another position that we'll have to deal with and understand their arguments. And then there's also the agnostic. Let me clear space to write that above here. Okay, so agnostic. Any sense of this? What could it be to be an agnostic? It's many ways to describe, but I think it could sort of be thought of as like a position intermediate between the others here. But anyway, what would you say if you could say anything on that? The agnostic category. What is this person all about when it comes to the question of God and so on? Sydney believes that humans cannot know whether God exists or not. Yeah, so it's kind of that middle ground position. It's an uncommitted position. It's the person who says, I neither affirm nor deny the existence of God. And usually that is a type of position one holds because they think that there's not enough evidence, correct, Sebastian, or proof to conclusively establish one or the other side. So yeah, it is a person who withholds judgment. They don't judge affirmatively or negatively. Sorry, let me write it correctly. Thank you. A person who withholds judgment. Why? Because of a perceived lack of evidence. Okay, so to the agnostics, both theism and atheism are not adequately supported by the available evidence. Sometimes it's thought to be kind of like a middle neutral position. Believers, non-believers, and like undecided folks. I've heard some argue, and the argument can be given, that agnosticism is not a genuine third category. Some people think that anything other than affirmative belief in God is just a version of atheism. So some people think that agnosticism is just atheism by a different name. I, though, do believe that it's probably best to have this three-part division because it just makes, to me, reasonable sense. People, some believe, some don't, and some take no kind of hard position either way because of the lack of evidence, or at least lack of the consideration of such evidence. Good. So now, our job, as we continue going through these lectures on the philosophy of religion, is to simply examine the best arguments and writings from people on all different sides of this topic. And what we're going to start off with are some of the best classical arguments from Western history that try to make the case for theism, and pair those together with objections and criticisms that some make against those same arguments. So there's always balance in a philosophy class. You learn an argument, then you learn a counter argument, and you have to be the one that can respond to questions about what the argument said and be able to accurately restate them in writing and so forth. Okay, so we're going to take a tour through some of the big, powerful arguments on the behalf of theism and see what they're all about, what some of these persuasive attempts to convince and persuade that God exists have said throughout history. Okay, so, well, we're going to look at many of the theist arguments, but we're starting with one from about 1,000 years ago, very classic and well-known in the West. So this is called the ontological argument. The ontological argument, okay, this is the name of the argument, and we can trace its history back to this man. His name is Saint Anselm. So Saint Anselm lived about 1,000 years ago in the medieval period, from 1033 until 1109 AD. So, I mean, this is now 2021. We're talking about 1033. So, you know, he was born almost 1,000 years ago, exactly, minus 12 years. And, you know, he lived in that medieval time period of Europe. So during his life, he was actually the Archbishop of Canterbury. So he held a political and government kind of official position. He was also a learned and literate person in a time when that was a rare distinction in some parts of Europe, of course. So in 1077, he published a book, and that book is called The Proslogion. So yeah, he was Archbishop of Canterbury, a church scholar, and in 1077, he wrote this book called The Proslogion. In the Proslogion book, we find this argument that we are now going to examine, called the ontological argument. And you can see here from his title, Saint Anselm, after his life ended, he was canonized as a saint in the Christian church for his contributions to the faith. And I say canonized as a saint in the Christian church because this time period is prior to the division of the church into Protestantism and Catholicism. So there wouldn't have been the identification of the lineage of saints as having more to do with Catholicism, which is kind of the current day standard. So anyway, Saint Anselm, major figure in the history of the Christian church, Archbishop of Canterbury, wrote the book The Proslogion in 1077, and it holds this argument inside called the ontological argument. Now we're going to review this argument, which is also printed in our anthology in our textbook. Okay, so I'm going to clear the board and let's just get into some of the details now about how the argument goes and how it tries to make the proof, the case that God exists. Okay, so before jumping into a few more details of the argument, I want to clarify one point as a sort of preliminary. You need to know this is not an argument that's based on what's called empirical evidence. It is not based on empirical evidence. But for that to be clear enough, let's try and get on the same page. What is empirical evidence? Does anybody know or have any idea about that? What kind of evidence is it if I say it's empirical? What do you think? Even if you're not 100% sure, it's okay to guess. What could be empirical evidence? Empirical evidence? Well, so Kylie, are you saying empirical evidence is not backed up by science? No, that's not quite correct. But if what you mean is saying that the argument is not based on empirical evidence means it's not based on science, that would be pretty well in line with the bright idea, yes. Sydney, you say scientific. Ben, you say stats. It's not stats so much. It has to do with the kind of evidence found in science, yes. Zoe, this is very good, that you can sense it. That's correct. And Cordy, you also add something valuable, which is that it's based in observation. Very good, correct. So it's the type of evidence that we call observable through the five senses. So it's sense perception that can take stock of this evidence, things that you can see, taste, touch, hear, or smell. So that's empirical evidence. I'm just going to write that really fast so you understand. Empirical evidence is evidence that can be observed by the five senses. Okay, so sometimes we call that physical evidence. It's the kind of evidence that is used in science because science involves observation of the world and collecting data based on what is observed. Let me give you one quick example. Dinosaurs. Did they exist? Yes. But what's the evidence? What gives us reasons to believe that dinosaurs one time roamed the planet Earth? What reasons, what evidence have we found? What gives us that evidence? Okay, good, it's fossils. And is that empirical evidence? Yes, that's stuff that archaeologists excavate from, some dig, and then they can assemble the skeleton, carbon date it. That gives us very, very good, almost ironclad evidence in the existence of the dinosaurs. But, okay, like I said, the ontological argument from St. Anselm, it's not based on empirical evidence. So it's not as if he says, you want to know whether God exists? Well, look, I went and I searched and I found this piece of fabric somewhere in a part of the world, and looking at it under a microscope, you can just sort of see it verifies that God exists. And that's not based on anything like that. I don't want you to get it, take it too far, though, in the wrong direction. Like, don't think that that makes it a bad, weak argument. Like, only arguments based on empirical evidence are good. No, there can be good arguments that are merely based on logic and concepts alone. And so that's kind of what his argument is. It's merely based on ideas, definitions, and logic. It's not at all based on drawing our attention to anything physical or observable. Clarifying that point. Now, so as we begin the discussion of his argument, the paper by kind of asking us to consider this. What kind of being is God believed to be? In other words, what are some of the common attributes or characteristic features that a person ordinarily associates with the idea, at least, the concept of God? So here we'll try and come up with some of these. I'm asking you to think of attributes of God. So in thinking about God and what God is, or how God is as a being, what features or attributes do you think come to mind in the mind of a person? What is God thought of like? Okay, so Sydney, very good. Right off the bat, you say omnipotent. I like that, because sometimes people don't exactly know this word and they will say the definition of it, which is fine, and they would say all-powerful. But omnipotent means all-powerful. Okay, so let me spend a moment on this before I move to the next one there, Sydney. Omnipotent, all-powerful. So potent refers to power, and omni means all. So all-powerful, meaning unlimited, infinite power. God is thought of as a being with power, but not just really powerful, all-powerful, having no limitations whatsoever. God could achieve anything what he wants to do merely through an act of will. So God is thought to have absolutely no limits on the exercise of his power. He's got awesome and unlimited, infinite power. Next up, and this is also mentioned here by Sydney, which is great, omniscient, okay? And so what that means is having all knowledge, all knowing. Okay, another concept or quality attributed to God is having knowledge and being wise, but not just having some knowledge and then other things are unknown to God or his knowledge isn't perfect. The claim is that God's knowledge is infinite and unlimited. So he knows everything from the biggest to the smallest details, everything that ever will or has happened. Nothing is hidden to God. God knows all. So that's omniscient. If you want to know, this word comes from scientia, which is Latin, and that's what knowledge it means in Latin originally. That's also where the word science comes from. So all knowledge, all knowing. Okay, I also see here McKenna and Lauren have written omnipresent. Very good, and that's another one of them. Let me explain the omnipresent concept really fast. So beings like me and you, we are in one place at a time. We're not everywhere all at once. Right now I'm in Long Beach. I'm not where you're at, and vice versa. But with God, the thought is that God is absolutely manifest throughout the whole universe everywhere. So it's not just like he's in some places and he's absent from other places, but God sees everything. He's everywhere at all times. That's the other part, being present at all times. Me and you were not present at all times. 100 years ago, none of us were here. And I guess in 1,000 years from now, none of us will be here. So we have a limited time span. But the idea of God is that his lifespan, or I can't even call it life because he's not born, but It's infinite in extent. So he's there always, throughout all time and space. So that's omnipresent, being everywhere all at once. And then one more. There's probably more that we could mention. Cordy, I see you have some good examples. Creator, the first cause. That I think kind of folds into the omnipotent quality, but it's something that could be mentioned aside. Transcendent, yes. I think in a way the omnipresence has to do with transcendent, being able to transcend like ordinary limits of time and space. There's one more that no one's mentioned yet, which is actually very important. Kylie, you seem to say there's a little bit of a connection issue. Maybe anybody else, can you confirm or deny that you're having the same issue? Let's just see. Taking 1 second to the side. Dropped a little bit, but not bad. A little. Yeah, well, again, connection issues are inevitable at times, but you will never lose the full content of the lecture. Nothing disappears off of the page. Static, a little blurry. Okay, well, we'll just make do. I think you can still hear me. Isn't that correct? Sorry to say, but once in a while there's a little bit of patchiness. But trust me, I've delivered enough of these lectures to know that any such issues do rectify and resolve. So it's going to be that we're just going to have to work with it as the tools that we got. Nonetheless, question though. One more of these big qualities. One more of these big qualities. It's having to do with, okay, so God we say is powerful, right? But he's not just mean or something. He's not just using his power to cause havoc and cause chaos and pain and misery. So that's a big hint. What do you think I'm mentioning there? It's about him being, well, I'll just throw it out there if I don't see you suggest it in a moment. But it's about the moral side of God, right? God is not like neutral morally or somehow even worse, evil. God is thought to be perfectly good and benevolent, like the best moral being that there could possibly be. So, omnibenevolent. And that just means all good, infinitely good, righteous, and morally just. Okay, so yeah. Well, when we look at all these various qualities that we've discussed right now, and you kind of summarize what they all mean if you add them up, Anselm himself doesn't go through like this point-by-point review of all the classical concept features of God, but he does sort of condense them down into one concise statement. And what he says they all reveal in the end is that God is thought of as the greatest conceivable being. So I'm just going to kind of make it so that these all add up to the greatest conceivable being. The greatest conceivable being. So like, in other words, the greatest being that you could even think of or conceive of in your mind, the greatest thing you could possibly imagine. Nothing greater than God can possibly be thought of or even contemplated in the mind. Now, about this phrase, the greatest conceivable being, I prefer to use this phrase in delivering the lecture because I think it's a little more easy for a student to parse and comprehend in the way it reads. But looking back at the text, you'll notice this slightly more awkward way of putting it that he often uses. So I want you not to be confused by that when you see it on the page. He will often, instead of using the statement greatest conceivable being, use this wording, the being than which none greater can be conceived. I've noticed, having taught this class so many times, that sometimes students trip on that weird phrasing, the being than which none greater can be conceived. Don't be confused. All that means is the greatest conceivable being. It's an equivalent statement. It's just being stated like in the comparative. God is the being than which no others can be conceived of as greater. So eliminating that little comparative turn of phrase, than which, we could merely say he's the greatest conceivable being standalone. Okay? So here's the big point of our leading in discussion. God is thought to be the greatest conceivable being. At least in the mind, we have that same idea of God. Let me read his words here and you'll see how he put it, okay? He says, well then, Lord, you who give understanding to faith, grant me that I may understand as much as you see fit, that you exist as we believe you to exist, and that you are what we believe you to be. Now, we believe that you are something than which nothing greater can be thought. Or can it be that a thing of such a nature does not exist, since, and now he quotes from the scriptures where in Psalms it says, the fool has said in his heart there's no God. So he says, can it be that a thing of such a nature does not exist, since, quote, the fool has said in his heart there is no God, unquote. But surely, when this same fool hears what I am speaking about, namely, something than which nothing greater can be thought, he understands what he hears, and what he understands is in his mind, even if he does not understand that it actually exists. Okay, so at this point, what he's trying to lay out on the table is that we have an idea of God as the greatest conceivable being. But now he makes an additional point that's important to his overall argument. And let's see if you can help me understand what that point is. He says, well, let me ask it as a question. Who do you think he is claiming has this definition of God in their mind? In other words, greatest conceivable being. Which people or types of people think of the definition or concept of God as the greatest conceivable being? What do you think he's saying about that? Whom has that idea of God in their mind? Greatest conceivable being. What do you think? Let's see what you think on that question. Who is he attributing this view of God to? That the God is the greatest conceivable being. Like, which people does he think holds that idea in the mind? Just a question. Which people do you think he claims are saying God is known as the greatest conceivable being? Okay, so Kylie, you throw out believers only. Brandon, you say monarchs. Jasmine, you saying believers. Well, actually, so I understand why you're saying that, because you're thinking, well, of course a believer sees God as the greatest conceivable being. And yes, true, they do. But does this surprise you? He says it's not just believers, and it's not just his followers. Even those that don't believe in God have the idea of his concept as the greatest conceivable being. So he's saying it's actually universal. Whether you're theist, atheist, or anything else, we can all at least agree on one point, which is, what does the definition of the word God mean? So with theists and atheists, he says they don't disagree about what the word God means. It means greatest conceivable being. What then is the actual difference between the theist and the atheist, if they can at least concur on the established definition of the word God? What's the difference then between theist and atheist? Because I'm telling you that he says everybody has the same definition of God. So Angel, you're correct. Everybody has the same definition of God, whether you're an atheist or not. So then what's the difference between an atheist and a theist, guys? It's not about the definition being different. They hold the same definition in mind. The real difference then is simply what? Let me know from that leading question I'm asking. Yeah, atheists don't believe, well, that God exists. And theists do believe that God exists. So, Olga, you say atheists don't live their life for God. Well, of course not, because there's no such thing according to an atheist. But the point is that an atheist doesn't think God is real, and a theist does think that God is real. So they have the same definition, but they disagree about whether it refers to anything real. Exactly, Brandon and Angel, yes. So now, let me read that point. Here's what he says. He says, surely when the fool, okay, quote, with a little side note, every time he talks about the quote-unquote fool now, it's like a hidden reference to the atheist, because he's referring back to the passage in the Psalms where it says, the fool said in his heart, there's no God. So even though it's not a nice way to put it, he keeps using the term fool. So he says, but surely when the same fool hears what I'm speaking about, namely something than which nothing greater can be thought, he understands what he hears. And what he understands is in his mind, even if he does not understand that it actually exists. Okay? Because it is one thing for an object to exist in the mind, and another thing to understand that an object actually exists. Okay, so let's clear the board and add some more information here. The next step in the presentation of his argument is to point out this idea that there are some things that exist only in the mind that are not actually real. But on the other hand, there are some things that, of course, exist in the mind and they're real in reality too. So I'm going to draw a little diagram. And on the left side of this diagram, the header says exists only in the mind. And on the right column, the header will say exists in both the mind and in reality. Okay, so now, just to kind of supply some content that we can think about, I'm going to ask some of you guys to help me fill in a little bit of info on the two sides of this ledger. So help me now. What are some things that you can tell me that exist only in the mind? Basically, make-believe stuff, stuff that's not real, stuff that is just the subject matter of like fiction or fantasy or whatever. But you can give me some examples. Things that exist only in your head. They're not real. So like what could be some examples? Now, Cordy, you say dreams. And it's interesting because a lot of times when I ask this question, that's one of the first initial responses that students give, not just you, but in a lot of different class settings. So for some reason, I feel like that must be intuitive as a first thought, but it's actually not quite correct because you can have dreams of real stuff. Like I can go to sleep tonight and have a dream about visiting the Eiffel Tower in Paris. And there is an Eiffel Tower out there in Paris. So you got to be a little more specific. Like some of the things you dream about are real things too. Okay. Emotions, same thing, Olga. I mean, well, a little different point. Emotions can be correlated with like the physical operations of your neurochemistry. So there is like a physical event happening that you could say is the real world corollary to whatever your psychological feelings inside are. So I'm thinking more of objects, guys. It's a little too abstract and philosophical, the first two suggestions. And that's where I like the next few things that are coming. Not fears, though, Kylie. It's another one of those. Wizards, zombies, stop it with the emotions, phobia, infinity, and all that stuff. I need objects. I need like objects, things, specific things. So aliens, that's a little bit presumptuous, Oliver. Maybe they're out there. We can't really say for sure. It's a big universe. So definitively things that are known to not actually be real. So like wizards is pretty much the only one so far that I'm actually seeing work. Come on, riff on that. Wizards, unicorns, dragons, good. And on and on and on. Hogwarts, right? It could be like any character from the different Marvel Comics universe, Godzilla, and the list goes on. Leprechauns, fairies, Santa Claus, Tooth Fairy, etc., etc. Okay, so I'm just talking about make-believe stuff that's not real. Just made-up ideas, creative inventions of our mind, but they're not actually real things in the world. Over here now. This side, I think, will be very easy to fill in. I guess it's a theoretical possibility, Olga, but the existence of the unicorn is only claimed in fantasy and fiction. Aliens, though, is such a broad concept. It could be paramecium on like the underside of like some mossy rock, like on the dark side of the moon. So it's, I would say, much more within the realm of reasonable possibility to say that some version of life, whatever it may be, is out there, rather than the very specific horned horse. But I take your point. It's well taken. Wakanda, Bigfoot, etc. Okay, let's go over here. Now, this is very easy, I hope, to fill in. Tell me about some things that you can think of right now in your mind, but they're not just in your head. They're out there and they're real too. So like externally real things that are real in reality, but they're also capable of being thought about. This should be easy. Look around you. It's just anything that's real. So what's such a thing? Let's see what your random examples might be here. Okay, someone says cheeseburgers. Good enough. Yes. Cheeseburger. You say cup, cats. Now here, how about this? You guys are saying some good things. Chapman, sure, Chapman University. It's over there in Orange. Some of you guys might be nearby to it in the dorms and stuff. Physical objects. How about not categories? Because physical objects is a very broad category. But how about a specific physical object, like the White House or the moon or something? You know what I mean? Okay, look. We could obviously do this forever. There's a lot of stuff out there in the world that's just real. So now, let's come back to the argument. Anselm says this: some things exist only in the mind, like these kind of things. On the other hand, some things exist in the mind, but they're also real on top of that. Question now: God, the greatest conceivable being, at least in our mind, Does this being only exist in the mind? Is God like, like a fake thing, like a made-up thing, like a unicorn, dragon, Godzilla, or wizards? Or is God, like one of these things that doesn't stop existing when you stop thinking about it? It's got its own external reality. Like Chapman University would still be there if you didn't even exist, okay? So is God something that's only in our head, or is God something that's real in reality? And now here's where he comes to his conclusion. He says, well, based on the definition of God, which is what? Greatest conceivable being. Based on that definition, God has to exist in both the mind and in reality. Why? Because simply stated, okay, what do you believe or think would be greater between these two possible options? Existing only in the mind, or existing in the mind, but on top of that, also existing in reality. Which of those two things is greater? Well, he thinks it's self-evident. It's greater to exist in both, because two is more than one. That's more ways of existing. Things that exist in the mind and in reality have all the same mental existence that these things have, but they have something additional beyond that, which is being real things as well. So if you follow his logic, then here's what he says. God is defined as the greatest conceivable being. Universally, all people define God that way. Believers, non-believers can agree on the definition. Now, does this thing only exist, does God only exist in the mind, or is he in the mind and in reality? Well, based on the definition, greatest conceivable being, he must exist in both, because if he did not, if he was only in the mind, then he would be less great than a being that exists in both. And that would imply that the greatest conceivable being is not the greatest thing that you could think of, which is absurd and contradictory. That would contradict the definition. Saying that the perfect being, the greatest being, isn't real would be like saying that the greatest conceivable being has a flaw or is less perfect than he could otherwise be. And that's where he sees a contradiction. So that's his conclusion. If we agree with the definition that God is the greatest conceivable being, and the further point that it is greater to exist in both the mind and in reality than only the mind, then that means God has to be on this side of this divider, in both mind and in reality. Why again? Let me remember why. Because if he didn't, then he would fail to be the greatest conceivable being, which would violate the definition, which is well established and understood by everybody. Okay, so let me read his words on this, and you can see how he puts this point. He says, when the fool hears what I'm speaking about, he understands what he hears, and what he understands is in his mind, even if he does not understand that it actually exists. Because it is one thing for an object to exist in the mind, and another thing to understand that an object actually exists. So when a painter plans beforehand what he's going to paint, okay, so he's giving us this example of a painter thinking in their mind of a painting that they are yet to construct. Before they set to the canvas to actually paint this thing, it's only in their head as an idea. So he says, when a painter plans beforehand what he's going to paint, he has the picture in his mind, but he does not yet think that it actually exists because he has not yet painted it. However, when he has actually painted it, then he both has it in his mind and understands that it exists because he now has made it. Okay? Even the fool, then, is forced to agree that something than which nothing greater can be thought exists in the mind, since he understands this when he hears it, and whatever is understood is in the mind. And surely, and this is key, and surely that than which a greater cannot be thought cannot exist in the mind alone, because if it exists only in the mind, it can be thought to exist in reality also, which is greater. If, then, that than which a greater cannot be thought exists in the mind alone, then this same that than which a greater cannot be thought is that than which a greater can be thought. But this is obviously impossible. Therefore, there is absolutely no doubt that something than which a greater cannot be thought exists both in the mind and in reality. Okay, so I've tried my best so far to bring these heady thoughts of the author down to earth a little bit. And there's just a couple of key points that you have to kind of keep in mind as you consider his argument. He's setting out to prove the existence of God in reality, not just in your mind. And he says, first of all, the definition of God is well understood by everybody, theists and atheists alike. And in general, it's the idea of the greatest conceivable being. So, furthermore, some things only exist in the mind and others exist in the mind and in reality. But out of those two options, it's greater to exist in both. And so given God's definition as greatest, he would have to therefore exist in both. Otherwise, we would contradict the definition that we started off this whole explanation with. Okay? So it's based on a definition and the point that it's greater to exist in the mind and reality than only the mind. Now, if he had ended his argument right there, I feel like it might have even been a little bit cleaner and more effective, but he adds an additional point after this that is in some ways, I think, a little bit more controversial, but nonetheless, we have to know about that too. So on the following page, he extends the argument just a stage further, and he says, not only have I proven God must exist in the mind and in reality, but he now continues to say, on top of this, God cannot even be thought not to exist. Okay? Now that's a little bit of a tricky phrase because there's a little bit of a double negative in there. But he said it, and I'll repeat it. God cannot be thought not to exist. Okay, so just chew on that sentence for a minute. God can't be thought to not exist. What he's saying is God is defined as the greatest conceivable being, and it's not as great if a thing can be thought not to exist. Take me, for example, okay? I'm your professor. I do exist. I'm lecturing for you right now, and we both know I exist. But as sad as it is, I can certainly consider and have considered thoughts of scenarios that could happen in which I would not exist. Like, you get on a plane and you're like, man, I hope this plane doesn't crash because then I would not exist or something. Or you think back, you're like, wow, I'm really glad my parents met. That was lucky for me because if they didn't, I wouldn't be here in this class or whatever, right? So there are things that could have happened or could happen that would make it so that I never existed or that I no longer exist. But with God, he says, God is too perfect and great to be thought of as not existing. Even in the mind, you can't think of God as non-existent. So, to add to his claims that he's made now, it's not only that God has to exist in the mind and in reality, but also, and now I want you to say this, I want you to be able to type it one time, just because I know it's such a confusing phrase that I want to make sure that it came through to you. So what is he right now saying? That God can't what? I'll get to your question in a moment, Ty, but let me get this from the group really fast. His current point is that God can't even be what? Just write it out one time, and then I'll see that you do know how to formulate the statement I'm mentioning. God is defined as the greatest conceivable being, and because of this, what follows? Yeah, God, well, put you completed my sentence, which is good, but maybe write it as a full statement. God cannot what? You've got it pretty much, Ty. I just wanted to have it the full statement, including the subject of the sentence. Don't leave it up to Ty, everybody. There's like 30 of you here. Someone else write it too. What am I mentioning? God cannot be what? God can, well, that's not it either, Olga. No. Ben, he can't, well, now you're getting it wrong also, Ben, because you said can't not. It's can't be thought not. Okay, Zachary, God cannot be thought to not exist. That's correct. Kylie, no. That is not it. No. He's saying God does exist, obviously. He's a theist. This man's arguing, the whole point is he's arguing that God does exist. If his conclusion was a being of this sort is too great to exist, that would be totally wrong. That would be what an atheist says. Theists believe God does exist. This is Saint Anselm, a saint in the Christian church. Nigel, his existence cannot be questioned. Well, I guess that's one way to say it. He can't be thought not to exist. God cannot even be thought of as not existing. God cannot be conceived of as not existing. Exactly. Okay, good. Just wanted to clarify that. And you see, it's important that I did that because if I didn't, there would be some of you saying, well, he means God has to exist. It's about whether you could even think that he doesn't. That's a separate point from that he must exist. The initial argument is he has to exist in the mind and reality due to the definition. This auxiliary additional point that follows is, on top of this, he can't even be thought not to. Okay? Now let me read his words on this and we'll close from here and then we'll resume next time, kind of continue, and we'll talk about objections next time. People who find fault with this argument. So if you found like something suspicious about it, you'll tune in on Friday and maybe you'll find that interesting. So here I'll read this and then we'll close. He says, and certainly this being so truly exists that it cannot be even thought not to exist, because something can be thought to exist that cannot be thought not to exist. And this is greater than that which can be thought not to exist. So if that than which a greater cannot be thought can be thought not to exist, then that than which a greater cannot be thought is not that than which a greater cannot be thought, which is absurd. Something than which a greater cannot be thought exists so truly then that it cannot be even thought not to exist. And then he continues and says to God, and you, Lord God, are this being. You exist so truly, Lord God, that you cannot even be thought not to exist, and this is as it should be, because if some intelligence could think of something better than you, The creature would be above the creator and would judge the creator, and that is completely absurd. In fact, everything else there is, except for you alone, can be thought of as not existing. You alone, then, of all things most truly exist, and therefore of all things possess existence to the highest degree, because if anything else does not exist as truly, and so possesses existence to a lesser degree. Why then did the fool say in his heart there is no God, when it is so evident to any rational mind that you of all things exist to the highest degree? Why indeed, unless because he was stupid and a fool? Now that's a harsh and I would say not appropriate way to discuss these matters, but he's writing in a much more universally religious time, so he helps himself to such terms as the fool and even calling the person stupid. Now I'm going to close, but let me see your question really fast, Ty. So did he exist before religion? Yeah, to those that believe that God exists, God has existed always. I mean, of course he existed before religion, because religion is only established by man on the planet Earth, but at least according to cosmology, the universe itself is billions of years older than the Earth. I know that might contradict some of the scriptures from Genesis according to the story of creation from the Bible. But in the modern mind, thinking of God is thinking of a being that ultimately exists. It's not an invention of the man or woman. So anyway, yeah, there you go. Good way to close it, Olga. That's on point for sure, kind of what I'm saying. Anyways, guys, thanks so much for a great meeting and a first lecture. We're going to continue on the same themes, continue reading through the syllabus, reading through the textbook according to the syllabus, and I'll see you guys back in about 48 hours on Friday. If you need anything between now and then, just feel free to email me or anything else. But for now, just have a good day. Take care, stay healthy, and I'll be back with you guys on Friday, okay? Take it easy. Let me know if you need anything, and go ahead and hit the like button or say goodbye if you want, just so I can make sure that you're hearing me and that we're still connected as I close the lecture. Can we do that? Okay, thanks, guys. Have a great one. See you next time. Bye-bye.